Hey there, I'm Hannah, and I'm 60 years old. You know that feeling when your world gets turned upside down by the people you love most? Well, that's exactly what happened to me when my own son kicked me out of my home for his new fiancée. You won't believe how I ended up becoming his landlord. The knot of dread in my stomach tightened into a hard, cold ball the moment my tires crunched onto the long, gravel driveway of my sprawling duplex. It was an annual ritual, this family reunion, a recurring nightmare dressed up as a pleasant gathering, and each year the air felt thicker with unspoken expectations and thinly veiled judgments. At 60, retired from teaching, I still felt like the perennial outsider, perpetually overlooked, a ghost at the feast, especially when compared to my seemingly perfect son, Ethan, now in his 30s, and his new fiancée, Brittany. Ethan lived in the downstairs apartment of this very duplex, a unit I'd helped him buy from me years ago, a generous arrangement that kept him close and, I thought, secure. My own apartment was the comfortable upstairs, filled with decades of my life. Uncle Mark, my late husband's brother, radiating a charm that felt as manufactured as a cheap suit, would deploy it relentlessly whenever Bethany, the true matriarch of his side of the family, was within earshot. He always seemed to be performing, his every gesture exaggerated, his voice just a touch too earnest. You see, this reunion was more about my husband's extended family, with Bethany being the anchor. My side, small and quiet, often faded into the background. Aunt Bethany, in her late 80s, was indeed the family's matriarch, from my husband's side, and the reunion revolved entirely around her. Her presence, even in her increasing frailty, was a gravitational pull. Every gaze, every hushed conversation, every overly solicitous gesture was directed her way, laced with an almost desperate anticipation. You could feel it in the air, a silent scramble for proximity to her wealth, her influence. As I stepped out of my car, the scent of blooming jasmine mingled with the acrid undertone of old money and newer greed, a smell I'd come to associate with these gatherings. I took a deep breath, trying to fortify myself against the emotional onslaught I knew was coming, unaware it would come from my own flesh and blood this time. The subtle digs from Ethan's new world began almost immediately. Brittany, gliding towards me across the manicured lawn with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, commented on my choice of casual wear. "Still dressing like you're ready for a hike, darling? This is a family affair, not an adventure." Her voice was smooth, like expensive silk, but the barb was sharp, designed to remind me of my unconventional life choices, my refusal to conform to the family's rigid expectations of white-collar success and manicured appearances. I just offered a tight-lipped smile in return. Ethan, my own son, usually so attuned to my feelings, merely stood beside her, a strange, almost vacant look in his eyes. He didn't interject, didn't defend me. It was a subtle shift, but one I felt keenly. Their condescension, usually a dull ache I'd grown accustomed to, felt amplified, more predatory now, as if their upcoming marriage gave them a license to be cruel. The thought gnawed at me. My own apartment, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a temporary dwelling, a place I was merely occupying until their grand plans solidified. The reunion had just begun, and already I felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding that went far beyond mere family drama. A quiet pride used to swell in my chest whenever I thought of Ethan. He was in his early 30s, and for years he'd lived in the downstairs apartment of this duplex, my duplex, inherited from my parents, a place steeped in generations of family history. I'd even helped him with the down payment when he decided to buy his unit from me, a generous arrangement that kept him close, and I thought, secure. We shared walls, but also a comforting sense of proximity. Then came Brittany, young, glamorous, with a sharp, calculating gleam in her eyes that sent an instinctive shiver down my spine. Ethan had just announced their engagement, and while I forced a smile and offered my congratulations, a tiny, cold dread began to coil in my gut. I tried to dismiss it as an older woman's overthinking, a mother's natural protectiveness, but the feeling persisted, whispering of an impending storm. The dread became a tangible weight a few evenings later. Ethan had come upstairs, uncharacteristically hesitant, fidgeting with his hands. Brittany, perched on my sofa, offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The air in my living room, usually so warm and familiar, suddenly felt thick with unspoken tension, as if a storm was brewing right within these four walls. He cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze, and I could feel my own heart rate quicken. "Mom," he began, his voice surprisingly firm, yet devoid of the warmth I was accustomed to. "Brittany and we've been talking. About the house." My heart rate hitched. "She has a vision," he continued, gesturing vaguely around my cozy, lived-in space, the very room where I had raised him, where we had shared countless memories. "For the whole duplex, for our future, and, well, she wants it all." Brittany then chimed in, her voice sweet but edged with steel, a subtle threat beneath the saccharine tone. "It's just Hannah, with our plans for a family, and needing space, we really need the entire property. Having a separate unit upstairs, it's just not conducive to our aesthetic or our privacy." She emphasized the words entire and aesthetic, with a dismissive wave of her hand that encompassed my life, my possessions, my very being. I stared at them, my mind struggling to process their words, trying to fit this cold, alien request into the framework of the loving son I thought I knew. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the horrifying reality disappear. Ethan finally met my eyes, and there was a flicker of something that might have been guilt, a fleeting shadow of the boy he once was, quickly overshadowed by a rigid, unyielding resolve. "We need you to move out, Mom," he said, the words falling from his lips like stones, each one chipping away at my composure. "Brittany wants the whole house. It's what she needs to feel truly at home here." He said, "truly at home," as if I, his mother, had somehow made her feel anything less than welcome. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the roaring sound of my own shattered expectations, my broken heart. This wasn't a request, it was a demand, delivered with the cold authority of a landlord to an unwanted tenant. My son, the boy I'd raised, supported, and loved unconditionally, was asking me to leave my own home, the place I'd lived for decades, all for a woman he'd known for barely a year. It was unthinkable. Truly, a betrayal of monumental proportions. The sheer ingratitude for my previous sacrifices, my unconditional love, was a bitter pill to swallow. I saw his love for Brittany, or what he perceived as love, blinding him to his own cruelty. He was a stranger, suddenly, molded into a callous figure by her influence. The words, "We need you to move out," ricocheted in my mind, each echo a fresh wound. I felt like I'd been struck, not by a physical blow, but by a sudden, chilling blast of emotional ice, leaving me numb and disoriented. Ethan, my son, stood before me, attempting to justify the unjustifiable, his explanation, a flimsy veil over his selfish motives. He spoke of Brittany's need for space, her vision for the house, as if my decades of memories, my entire life upstairs, were just inconvenient clutter to be swept aside. "It's not personal, Mom," he'd insisted, his eyes still avoiding mine, fixed somewhere over my shoulder, refusing to meet the pain in my own. "It's just a new chapter for us, a fresh start. And the upstairs, well, it's just in the way of that." His voice held a false note of regret, a performative sadness that did little to assuage the sting. Brittany, meanwhile, had taken to making pointed comments, thinly veiled critiques, disguised as helpful suggestions, delivered with a saccharine smile. "Oh, Hannah, darling, are those still the original curtains? My goodness, they must be positively ancient." Or, "This wallpaper, bless its heart, screams Grandma's house, doesn't it? We'll definitely be updating." Her passive-aggressive remarks about my clutter and my old-fashioned decor felt like a systematic erasure of my presence, my identity within these very walls. Each word was a tiny, stinging humiliation designed to make me feel obsolete, a relic to be moved out of sight. She was marking her territory, staking her claim, and trampling over my existence in the process. The heartbreak was a physical ache in my chest, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe, not just for the imminent loss of my home, but for the profound betrayal from Ethan. He was prioritizing this woman, this fleeting engagement, over his own mother, the woman who had helped him buy his half of this very house, who had always been his unwavering support system through childhood scrapes, teenage angst, and early career stumbles. His blatant ingratitude for my previous sacrifices, my unconditional love, was a bitter pill to swallow, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. I saw his love for Brittany, or what he perceived as love, blinding him to his own cruelty, transforming him into someone I barely recognized. He was a stranger suddenly, molded into a callous figure by her insidious influence. I tried to appeal to him, to his sense of decency, to the years of shared history within these walls. Ethan, this isn't just an apartment to me. This is my home. This is where you grew up, where your grandparents lived, where we celebrated holidays and weathered storms. He just shrugged, looking uncomfortable, his gaze flitting around the room as if searching for an escape. Times change, Mom, he'd muttered, his voice flat. We need to move forward, you understand. Brittany stood by his side, a silent, triumphant sentinel, her posture radiating satisfaction. I felt utterly humiliated, reduced to a mere obstacle in their path to domestic bliss, an inconvenient piece of furniture to be shuffled out of the way. The very thought of having to pack up my life, to dismantle decades of memories, filled me with a deep, consuming despair that bordered on panic. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cold, inhospitable place, ready to swallow me whole and spit me out onto the street. The sting of their indifference was far worse than the thought of homelessness itself. I felt like a discarded piece of furniture, easily replaced, easily forgotten, and the prospect of finding a new, affordable place on my modest teacher's pension seemed insurmountable. The boxes began to appear, silent, mocking monuments to my displacement. Each one I packed felt like a piece of my life, a memory, being sealed away and marked for an uncertain future. The search for a new place to live was a grim, soul-crushing exercise. My teacher's pension, while stable, wasn't exactly overflowing. Affordable apartments in this area were scarce, and the ones I found were small, uninspired, and devoid of any character. Each viewing felt like a step down, a further descent into a future I hadn't anticipated and certainly hadn't deserved. I looked at sterile, box-like rooms, imagining my cozy, sun-filled space in the duplex, and a deep sense of loss would wash over me, making my eyes sting with unshed tears. That duplex wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was the echo of my parents' laughter, the smell of my mother's baking, the scuff marks on the floor from Ethan's first tricycle, the faint scent of my late husband's pipe tobacco clinging to the old wood. It was my history, my sanctuary, and now it was being systematically stripped away by the very person I had dedicated my life to. Ethan and Brittany offered no real help, only vague suggestions muttered in passing, or hurried goodbyes as they rushed off to wedding planning appointments or house tours for their vision. Have you found anything yet, Mom? There are some lovely senior living communities, I hear. Brittany would chirp, completely missing, or perhaps intentionally ignoring, the profound insult in her words, the implication that I was old, frail, and ready to be warehoused. Ethan would just nod along, avoiding my gaze, his silence louder than any words, making it painfully clear that I was nothing more than a burden, a problem to be solved and then forgotten. Their eagerness to see me gone was palpable. I could feel it radiating from downstairs, a constant pressure. They wanted their whole house, their vision, untainted by my old-fashioned presence, my inconvenient existence. I saw them measuring for new furniture, discussing renovations, painting swatches on the walls, all while my life was being systematically dismantled just a floor above, a cruel irony. The injustice gnawed at me, a constant, dull ache that overshadowed everything else. The loneliness was a heavy cloak, wrapping itself around me and pressing down. Friends offered sympathy, but no real solutions. I found myself spending more time at coffee shops, lingering in parks, anything to avoid facing the half-packed boxes in my own home, the constant presence of my son and his fiancée downstairs, their laughter and excited murmurs drifting up through the floorboards like a taunt. I felt increasingly abandoned, cast adrift in a world that suddenly felt cold and indifferent to my plight. My independence, once a source of quiet pride, now felt like a fragile shield against a relentless tide of despair. I missed the comfort of routine, the familiarity of my neighbors, the simple joy of my own garden. Every day felt like a countdown to my forced exile, a ticking clock of humiliation. The sense of isolation grew, a bitter companion in my painful search. I was adrift, without a true home, and the people who should have been my anchor were actively pushing me out to sea, their actions a cruel testament to their selfishness. I realized, with a chilling clarity, that I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. The relentless search for a new place had worn me thin, mentally and emotionally. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, drifting through open houses and filling out applications, each one feeling more futile than the last. My mind was foggy with exhaustion and despair. One dreary afternoon, while sifting through a stack of old, forgotten mail that had accumulated in a dusty corner of my attic, things I hadn't looked at since my parents passed, my fingers brushed against a thick envelope. It was a foreclosure notice, yellowed with age, addressed to the previous owner of the entire duplex from decades ago. I remembered my parents briefly mentioning some complex legal issues surrounding the property when they first bought it, something about a previous owner who had lost it. But the details were fuzzy, lost to time and childhood ignorance. Holding the notice, a tiny spark ignited in the gloom of my thoughts. It wasn't just a random piece of paper. It sparked a memory, a fleeting conversation my father once had about how the duplex, despite appearing as one large house, was originally structured with two separate deeds when his family first acquired it, not just one unified property. He had always been meticulous about legal details. I remembered him saying something about keeping the lines clean, even when they consolidated the ownership. Curiosity, a welcome distraction from my misery, compelled me to dig deeper. I went through old financial files, boxes of legal documents I'd inherited, but never truly scrutinized, deeming them boring adult stuff. Then, amidst a stack of dusty bank statements and old tax returns, I found it. An old, forgotten document, a loan agreement from years prior when I helped Ethan buy his half of the duplex from me. It wasn't just a simple transfer, it was a formal agreement I'd drawn up with a small local lawyer friend at the time to protect both our interests, specifying the terms under which he was acquiring his downstairs unit. I remembered my father had advised me to do it that way, just in case. My eyes scanned the legalese, my heart starting to pound. And there it was, in clear, if somewhat archaic, legal jargon. A clause stating that if Ethan defaulted on certain stipulated payments related to the property as a whole, or failed to maintain specific aspects outlined in the agreement, the entire property could, by legal right, revert to me. It wasn't about his mortgage to the bank, it was about the original terms of my internal sale to him, terms that were meant to protect the integrity of the property itself. This small detail, combined with the earlier memory of the separate deeds and the old foreclosure notice, planted a seed of a very audacious, almost unbelievable idea. Could it be? Could there be a way to fight back, legally and definitively? The crushing weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a thrilling, dangerous sense of possibility. Intrigued, and with a desperate glimmer of hope, I immediately thought of the real estate lawyer my old friend Susan had always raved about, a sharp, no-nonsense woman known for her keen eye for detail and her aggressive pursuit of justice for her clients. I made an appointment for the very next day, clutching the old loan agreement and the vague memory of my father's words like a lifeline. Sitting in her sleek, modern office, I laid out my convoluted story, explaining the initial arrangement with Ethan, the separate deeds, my forced eviction, and the peculiar clause I'd stumbled upon in the old loan document. I watched her closely as I spoke, trying to gauge her reaction. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable at first, just a slight frown of concentration. Then, as I detailed the specific wording of the loan agreement, her eyes widened, a flicker of professional interest replacing her neutral gaze. She took the document from me, reading it carefully, occasionally muttering under her breath. "Fascinating," she said, looking up, a faint smile touching her lips. "This is unusual, but not unheard of. A sort of reversionary interest clause tied to specific performance." She explained that if the original sale of the duplex was indeed structured as two separate, albeit concurrent, transactions, even if now appearing consolidated on a newer deed, and if Ethan had defaulted on any of the specific performance clauses outlined in my internal loan agreement with him for the downstairs, the entire property could legally revert to me. She also highlighted that many people, in their haste to finalize a property deal, often overlook subtle but crucial clauses in older, underlying agreements. "The devil," she remarked dryly, "is always in the details, and the older the details, sometimes the more powerful they are." She picked up the phone. "Let me look into the original property records, the historical deeds, and any public filings related to Ethan's purchase." She worked quickly, efficient, and focused. As I waited, my stomach fluttered with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Could this really be happening? Could this forgotten piece of paper be my salvation? When she hung up, her smile was more pronounced. "Ms. Miller," she said, her voice firm with certainty, "it appears your father was a very shrewd man, and you, it seems, have just stumbled upon a very powerful legal position." She confirmed that the duplex had indeed been partitioned historically with two separate deeds, which had been consolidated under later ownership, but the underlying legal framework had never been entirely dissolved, allowing my specific loan agreement with Ethan to hold significant weight. The loophole was real. My audacious idea was not just a pipe dream, it was a solid legal strategy. The lawyer's investigation further confirmed my audacious theory, solidifying the glimmer of hope into a blazing certainty. She found additional documentation, dusty but legally binding, that showed how the duplex had indeed originated as two distinct units, legally partitioned, even though it was later sold as a single property. When I had helped Ethan buy his downstairs apartment from me, the internal loan agreement I had him sign, following my father's meticulous advice, contained clauses that were linked to these older, underlying property structures. It wasn't just about him making his bank mortgage payments, it was about specific, ongoing responsibilities related to property taxes, shared maintenance costs, and even adherence to certain architectural covenants from the original subdivision. These were subtle, almost invisible conditions tied to my initial financing help, legacy clauses, from how the duplex was originally partitioned for sale. Ethan, in his eagerness to take full control, or perhaps simply out of ignorance, never formally severed the original arrangement, the lawyer explained, tracing a line on one of the documents. He was focused on his mortgage with the bank, but he neglected the stipulations in your agreement with him, the one that governs his portion of the property v. your original ownership of the whole. She pointed to a section. He missed a payment for a specific, shared property tax assessment from 2 years ago, which you, unknowingly, covered because it came through your original property tax account. He also failed to adequately contribute to certain structural maintenance funds outlined here. These were defaults, albeit technical ones, that were clearly outlined as triggers for the reversion clause. "So," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the implications of her words sinking in, "you're saying?" She nodded, her expression resolute. "Miss Miller, based on this loan agreement and the historical property records, Ethan has been in technical default. You have a very strong legal claim to the entire property. The original terms, designed to protect your interests, have been triggered. The duplex, by the letter of this law, can indeed revert back to you." The news hit me like a tidal wave, a wave of vindication, of power, of disbelief. My son, in his rush to push me out, had unknowingly handed me the keys to his own undoing. He thought he was secure, but he had overlooked the fine print, the legacy of my father's careful planning, and my own dormant right. A cold, steely resolve began to replace the hurt and humiliation that had plagued me for weeks. This wasn't just about getting my home back, it was about making Ethan and Brittany truly understand the consequences of their ingratitude and cruelty. This was about justice. The feeling was intoxicating, a powerful surge of defiance after weeks of feeling utterly powerless. My audacious idea was no longer just an idea, it was a tangible, legal path to reclaiming not just my home, but my dignity. Armed with this newfound knowledge and the lawyer's unwavering confidence, a very clear, very audacious master plan began to form in my mind. It was no longer just about getting my home back. It was about making Ethan and Brittany truly understand, in a way they couldn't ignore, the profound consequences of their ingratitude and cruelty. I wouldn't just reclaim the duplex. I would do it in a way that would force them to confront the reality of their actions, a public, undeniable reversal of fortunes. I decided that I would exercise the clause and buy the entire duplex back, legally and definitively, but with a specific, humiliating reveal in mind. The satisfaction of this thought began to replace the raw ache of betrayal. My lawyer, a pragmatic woman, helped me map out the steps. The first was to officially serve notice of Ethan's technical default, a legal formality that would begin the process of triggering the reversion clause. This would be done subtly at first, through proper legal channels, avoiding any direct confrontation that might tip them off prematurely. Then, I would prepare for the acquisition. I leveraged a long-forgotten inheritance from a distant great-aunt, a small but significant sum that I had squirreled away for emergencies and had largely forgotten about, a true godsend. Combined with my modest teacher's pension, which allowed me to secure a new, strategic loan, I had the financial means to execute the plan. It was a complex, multi-step legal process involving property transfers, official filings, and the meticulous untangling of the layered deeds. Every step was executed in complete secrecy from Ethan and Brittany. My lawyer handled the paperwork with quiet efficiency, the timing crucial for the eventual reveal. Week by week, silently, unbeknownst to them, the duplex moved closer to becoming entirely mine again. The anticipation was a constant hum beneath my skin, a cold, calculated excitement. The deed, by the end of this meticulous process, would be fully and legally in my name, signed, sealed, and waiting for its dramatic unveiling. The thought of their faces, when they finally understood, was the only fuel I needed. Ethan and Brittany, meanwhile, were blissfully unaware, lost in a bubble of self-congratulation and wedding preparations. They were tearing down walls, selecting new paint colors, and making grand plans for the whole house they now believed was entirely theirs. Their social media posts, which I occasionally glimpsed through mutual friends, showed them happily posing in front of newly painted walls, always with a subtle, smug tone. They often complained about their impossible old landlady, me, now gone from their lives, making snide remarks about my clutter, how much better the house felt without me, and how they were finally free to create their dream home. I heard snippets of their conversations from old neighbors who still occasionally called me, or from other distant relatives who simply didn't know the full story. Their arrogance, their blatant disrespect, fueled my resolve, sharpening the edge of my planned comeback. I knew they were also busy planning their lavish wedding, pouring money into what they clearly saw as a grand spectacle. This absorption in their own narrative, their belief in their complete control over their lives and their new home, was their Achilles heel. They never once questioned the quiet legal papers that were processed, never looked beyond the surface of their assumed ownership. They were too busy relishing their victory, too confident in their perceived cleverness. I observed them from a distance, gathering strength, polishing my plan. I allowed myself a small, grim smile. They were dancing on the grave of my dignity, but they had no idea I was about to orchestrate their final, very public, fall. The house was now legally mine, acquired through the very loophole their greed had exposed. The stage was set for their rude awakening. The morning the notice arrived, it was like any other. Ethan and Brittany, probably still groggy from a late night of wedding planning, stumbled out to their mailbox. A formal, legal envelope lay nestled among the junk mail and wedding invitations. It was an eviction notice, cold and unfeeling, addressed to the occupants of the downstairs unit. I watched from my upstairs window, my heart pounding, but my hands steady. They were furious. I could hear their shouts from downstairs, muffled but clear. "This is a mistake," Ethan bellowed, his voice filled with indignation. "It must be some scam. We own this place." They believed it was a gross error from a new, unknown landlord, some faceless entity trying to trick them. Minutes later, my phone rang. It was Ethan, his voice a frantic mixture of anger and panic. "Mom, have you heard about this? Some absurd eviction notice just arrived. It's ridiculous. You know the house is ours, right? Who is this new landlord? They must be crazy." He clearly assumed I knew nothing, that I was still the powerless evicted mother. My voice was calm, almost detached, a stark contrast to his rising hysteria. "Ethan," I said, a deliberate pause, "I suggest you read the fine print very carefully. All of it." I could practically hear his confusion, then his growing frustration. He muttered something about lawyers, about ridiculous clauses, but I just repeated, "Read the fine print." I hung up, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. The bait was taken. They were still oblivious to the trap I had meticulously set. Their ignorance was bliss for me, and about to become their living nightmare. The quiet satisfaction was immense. Within minutes, I heard frantic footsteps on the stairs, then a furious pounding on my door. Ethan and Brittany burst in, their faces contorted with rage and disbelief. "What is this, Mom?" Ethan demanded, thrusting the eviction notice at me, his hand shaking. "Are you out of your mind? This is our home. You can't do this." Brittany's eyes were wide with a mix of terror and fury, her carefully composed facade shattered. "You're trying to defraud us. We'll sue you into the ground," she shrieked, her voice shrill. I simply stood there, calmly, my lawyer by my side, a small concession to ensuring this went exactly as planned. She held a neat stack of documents. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to their escalating hysteria. "Brittany, please, sit." They stood frozen, their eyes darting between me and the lawyer. "This isn't fraud," I continued, gesturing to the papers. "This is the law you conveniently overlooked." My lawyer then stepped forward, presenting the re-signed deed, freshly stamped and notarized, along with the original loan agreement I had with Ethan, open to the specific clause. "Miss Miller," she began, her voice crisp and professional, "your mother exercised a legal right based on this binding agreement. Your failure to meet certain conditions, specifically regarding property tax contributions and maintenance funds, has triggered the reversion clause. As of this morning, the full ownership of this duplex has legally reverted to Miss Miller." The look on their faces was a masterpiece of dawning horror, disbelief warred with shock, then a sickening realization. Ethan swayed slightly, his mouth agape. Brittany's jaw dropped, her face paling to an ashen gray. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that's impossible. We bought this house." I stepped forward then, meeting his gaze directly, no longer just his mother, but his landlord. "You bought half, Ethan, under my terms. Terms you violated. Now, you live here under my terms, or you don't live here at all." The shift in power was palpable, a chilling silence descending as the gravity of their situation finally, unequivocally, sank in. The house they thought they owned, the dream home they had so cruelly taken from me, was now firmly, legally, undeniably mine again. The immediate fallout was explosive, a hurricane of denial and accusations. Ethan and Brittany refused to believe it, their minds unable to process the total reversal of their fortunes. "You're crazy, Mom. This is some elaborate scheme. You can't just take our house," Ethan shrieked, his face red with a mixture of rage and terror. Brittany, usually so poised, dissolved into tears, screaming about fraud and how I was ruining their lives, their wedding, their future. They called other family members, twisting the story, painting me as the villain, the senile old woman who had snapped. My phone rang off the hook, with concerned, confused, or outright accusatory relatives. Some were genuinely bewildered. Others, those who had always sided with Ethan, were furious on his behalf, unable to grasp the depths of his betrayal. But I stood firm, an unyielding rock amidst their storm, backed by my lawyer and the irrefutable legal documents. The reality of their situation: they were now tenants in the house they once believed was fully theirs, at the mercy of the mother they had so cruelly discarded, began to sink in with brutal finality. The lawyers exchanged letters, the legal system confirmed my claim, and slowly, grudgingly, they had no choice but to accept it. Their attempts to rally other family members against me largely failed once my lawyer quietly provided irrefutable proof of their manipulation and the clear breach of contract. The family, already fractured by underlying tensions and jealousies, was now irreparable. The truth was out, exposed for all to see. The humiliation they had inflicted on me was now reflected back on them 100-fold, amplified by the public knowledge of their greed. The noise from downstairs, once their joyous plans, was now replaced by bitter arguments and the sounds of furniture being dragged across the floor as they began to truly grasp their predicament. With the legalities settled and their desperate appeals exhausted, I became the undeniable landlord, and I began to set the new terms. I didn't kick them out immediately, that would have been too swift a mercy. Instead, I instituted strict, unyielding rules for their tenancy. "Rent is due on the first of every month, Ethan," I stated calmly, handing him a formal lease agreement drawn up by my lawyer. "No exceptions, no grace periods." His face tightened with barely suppressed fury. "And maintenance requests," I continued, "will go through proper channels, submitted in writing. No more banging on my door in the middle of the night for a leaky faucet. Noise complaints would be addressed too, with formal warnings if their arguments or loud parties disturbed my peace." I remained civil, yet unyielding. Every interaction was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth or motherly affection. Every request they made, every payment they begrudgingly handed over, was a quiet, constant reminder of their previous cruelty and my newfound, undeniable power. They were forced to live under my terms, in the very house they had so arrogantly tried to usurp. I installed surveillance cameras outside the duplex, citing security concerns for my property, a subtle nod to their past deceit. Their once free reign within those walls was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of being watched, being controlled. Their dream home had become their gilded cage, meticulously managed by the woman they had thrown out. The tension in the house was thick, a constant, palpable presence, and every polite, businesslike exchange was a quiet, victorious battle. I saw the slow burn of resentment in Ethan's eyes, the seething fury in Brittany's, and I knew my revenge was a dish best served cold, in monthly installments. The relentless pressure, the constant humiliation of living under my strict rules, and the undeniable financial strain of paying legitimate rent eventually became too much for Ethan and Brittany. They couldn't bear living under my rule, seeing me, the mother they had so cruelly cast aside, as their landlord. The very walls of the downstairs apartment, once filled with their grand plans, now echoed with their bitter arguments and recriminations. I often heard them through the floorboards, their voices laced with anger and regret, railing against their misfortune, never quite realizing it was of their own making. Eventually, the moving truck arrived, not for me, but for them. They moved out, their departure marked not by a triumphant send-off, but by quiet, sullen packing and a hasty, unceremonious exit. No goodbyes, no apologies. Just the silence of a space reclaimed. The house was entirely mine once more, a monument to my resilience and ingenuity. The duplex, once a source of pain, now stood as a symbol of my hard-won victory. I walked through the downstairs apartment they had so arrogantly claimed, seeing it now as a blank canvas, purged of their greedy influence. I decided to rent out the downstairs unit to a respectful, quiet tenant, someone who appreciated the history and warmth of the home, ensuring a steady income that further secured my independence. Or perhaps I might just enjoy the entire duplex myself, reveling in the expansive space, the quiet solitude, and the profound sense of peace it now offered. The final scene of that chapter of my life saw me sitting on my porch swing, watching the sunset cast long, warm shadows across my lawn. I was truly at home, free from the burden of their ingratitude, savoring my hard-won victory, and reclaiming my life entirely on my own terms. My son had kicked me out, but in doing so, he had unwittingly paved the way for my ultimate triumph. It was a new chapter, a new home, and for me, a truly liberated new beginning.